U.S. today is way beyond optimal protection of intellectual property. There's no reason Disney should have a monopoly, an ongoing patent on Disney.
It looks like that might actually expire. We're coming up on the easy.
Yeah, then they're going to pay lobbyists to extend it for another couple of decades. And then it leads to all kinds of rent seeking in terms of fighting over these property rights.
How would it work for something like software that's really capitalized?
Well, notice that software is a good case where legally it's protected, but de facto it's not protected. In other words, it's de facto it's a public good. You invent software, you give it to someone else, and it's very easy for them to give it to the rest of the world. So how do software companies get around that? Well, initially they tried copy protections, but those were inconvenient for the genuine users and easy to get around for the people who wanted to steal. So now the standard way is to connect the software, right, with a telephone number, where at which you get information about the software and help about the software, but you have to prove that you actually paid for the software or someone paid for the software in order to get the help. So you combine a de facto non-excludable good with an excludable good, and it'd be hard to argue that software is underproduced in the U.S. today, right? So, entrepreneurs figure out ways of getting around these problems, which is not to deny that there might be some innovations that, utopia is not an option. And let's say that I'm wrong about the optimal level of intellectual property being zero. Let's say, well, it would be a little bit stronger than that. You still have to ask the question, government gives us too much IP protection. Zero would give us too little. All right. In the real world, which state is going to be less efficient? They're both inefficient, but you could argue that zero is not as inefficient as what the government is inevitably going to give you if you give them the power to bestow intellectual property rights. But you see, that's not the way most people think about things, right? They compare how the market works in the real world with their ideal government, even though those policies are never going to be implemented. It's never going to exist. And so we have this, I think I mentioned this asymmetry, right? Where the market fails, the general solution is more government intervention. When the government fails, the general solution is more government intervention. All right, so I guess we're going to be one short this evening. We almost finished the discussion of growth, but I was sort of racing at the end, trying to present to you my simple model extending the Laffer curve as a way of thinking about economic growth. So I want to wrap that up. I put in nice colors sort of the schematic way I think about this, which is very similar to a diagram in Snowden and Bain. Technological innovation, capital accumulation, and lower transaction costs, but particularly technological innovation and capital accumulation have to come together to give you sustained growth. And all the models we've been looking at are the formal models are about these proximate causes, what gives you these, and which is the binding constraint. So for instance, I would argue, if we were to compare the Solow model with Austrian theory, the Solow model says technology is the binding constraint and capital accumulation without technological innovation only gives you a level effect. To flip that around, Austrian theory says capital accumulation is the binding constraint, and technological innovation without capital accumulation doesn't give you anything. Right? It just leaves you stuck in the Malthusian trap that preceded societies. There was a lot of technological innovation prior to the Industrial Revolution, and it didn't generate sustained economic growth. Also, one of the things I didn't mention last time is the Solow model is caught in an inner contradiction, because the Solow model is based on the assumption that technology is a public good, non-excludable, and then concludes that technology is the binding constraint and what keeps poor countries poor. Well, which way is it? Now, obviously you can add on and get more complicated and resolve that issue, but it's still a fundamental problem in the Solow model. But in any case, I was arguing that most of the cutting edge work is now in the area of institutions, where there's not perfect agreement, but there is more agreement than there is about the proximate causes. In other words, basically there's agreement that institutions matter a lot, and these institutions have to be involve property rights, and you need a certain amount of property right protection. You need to be certain that that your stuff is not going to be stolen if you engage in technological innovation or capital accumulation. And so I suggested a way to model that was by taking the standard Laffer curve but extending it to think about not just a single tax, but all of the government's takings, all of the government's exactions. And so you have an exaction rate on the horizontal axis, or, depends on how you want to, you could call it a predation rate, an expropriation rate, an exploitation rate. I think exaction rate is probably the least loaded of the of those terms. In other words, how much of the underlying economy is the government seizing, and then you have the total amount of revenue, or the total exaction from all of these sources. And you can think of it as exhibiting the same shape as your standard Laffer curve. All right? Now, by the way, last time I used the term deadweight loss, and then I thought, I'm not sure everybody in the room is comfortable with that term. So, have you all heard the term deadweight loss? Yes? 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 Okay. So, most taxes, not all taxes, involve some deadweight loss, and as the tax rate gets higher, the deadweight loss gets more severe, and then you have certain things certain policies that you can think of as taxes that are designed to maximize deadweight loss, like the laws against heroin are designed to be over here. So if we think about government this way, it first of all allows us to incorporate Mansour-Olson's observation. And by the way, this is consistent with most historians, that most governments arose through conquest. And so the way he would term this is governments start out as roving bandits, but eventually they gravitate towards stationary bandits. Roving bandits might expropriate everything from the host population, and that's not a long-run viable solution. So they tend to, so the origin of the state is sort of the movement of these ruling classes from this area to this area. This is the amount of expropriation that maximizes revenue for the ruling class. But it's not likely to be the amount of exaction that maximizes growth. And in fact, we have some evidence for this with respect to developed countries, that there is an inverse relationship between the size of government as a percent of GDP and the amount and the rate of economic growth. It's not the only factor, and we'll talk about why it may not apply to less developed countries in a moment. But this is one overhead that looks at total government expenditures at the beginning of the decade as a percent of GDP for developed countries, 23 OECD countries, and this is their decade-long growth rate. And there's the regression. Okay? More government spending as a percent of GDP, lower growth rate. And here is a bar diagram that compares in what period, 1990 to 2003, countries with government spending exceeding 58% of GDP and their growth rates, and countries with government spending less than 37% of GDP and their growth rates. So as I suggested last week, there's some level here to the left of the maximum where a country is going to start enjoying sustained economic growth. And once it starts to enjoy sustained economic growth, your curve shifts upward because the economy is getting bigger on a per capita basis. And I suggested that essentially the story of the British Empire. Now you can also pull into this model William Baumel's distinction between entrepreneurial rent-seeking and productive entrepreneurship. In other words, people who are entrepreneurs in an institutional environment that encourages a lot of transfers are going to be involved in a lot of rent-seeking. And if the institutional environment discourages transfers or makes them more difficult, they're going to shift their entrepreneurship from rent-seeking activities, where they're actually just shifting resources from one person to another, one group to another, to productive activities. By the way, William Baumol almost was being considered for the Nobel Prize in Economics, but then it can only be given to living economists, and he died before the final decision was made in the year he was being considered. But he made a lot of contributions to economics. And the economics of entrepreneurship is just part of it. All right, so now, all right, that's where I was last time, okay? Now, this relationship between the size of government and the rate of growth doesn't appear to hold in African countries, and it's not the only factor that's involved. In other words, this model, this extended Laffer curve or aggregate Laffer curve, is oversimplified in two respects. One is you have to think about centralized exactions versus decentralized exactions, and most of the data we have focuses on the revenue generated by the central government. But we know historically there have been profound and extensive decentralized forms of predation. The serfdom system in medieval Europe, all right? The central states in medieval Europe generated very, very little revenue, especially in the early period of feudalism. The kings were not generating a lot of revenue, but if you go down to the level of the serfs, right, which was 80 to 90% of the population, it turns out that estimates are that more than 50%, and sometimes in the neighborhood of 70 to 80% of their output was being expropriated in dues to the Lord, dues to the church, dues, in other words, all of these forms of exaction they lived under. So you have to bear that in mind, because many of your ancient polities had a very decentralized system of exaction. The other thing is you have to bring in the element of uncertainty. In other words, a businessman will prefer a certain, let's say, a tax rate of 30% that he is absolutely certain will persist into the foreseeable future over a tax rate of 5% that in 5 years could turn into total expropriation. And again, that's a major difference in Europe between the modern world and the medieval world. One classic case of this involves the Stuart monarchs. One of the factors bringing on the English Civil War was the Stuart monarchs. A lot of merchants were holding their gold and silver for safekeeping at the Royal Mint, and I think it was Charles I, just expropriated $130 billion a forced loan, which he didn't repay, in order to finance a war. Right? Now, and you can think about this with respect to why did it take the collapse of the Soviet Union for people to want to invest in Eastern Europe? Well, because under the socialist regimes, you had to worry about, even if they temporarily opened the door to investment, you had to worry about expropriation. So uncertainty can also play a role. So I think this gives us a way, at least a broad way of thinking about what was required to bring about sustained economic growth and why it took so long. Right? And then the question arises, why did it take place first in the West? Why did it start in England in the 18th century? And one commonplace observation among historians, and some economic historians, is that this was a result of the unique political fragmentation of the West, which persisted for a really long time. From the fall of the Roman Empire until today, right, Europe has never been politically unified. Whereas, China, right? I mean, there's periods in which the empire collapsed, but China is essentially, the whole trading zone is united under an imperial regime off and on from the 3rd century BCE.
Oh, sorry, not to get off topic, but you mentioned that the model, it doesn't necessarily apply to African countries. Is that?
Yeah, well, that's because I think a lot of the predation doesn't show up in government revenue. A lot of the predation shows up in corruption, bribery, and a lot of the predation takes place at a decentralized level where this is sort of, remember that in poor countries, the size of the underground economy is much larger. Well, if the underground economy